and Mr. John Sitilides, Geopolitical Strategist from CNI. Thank you so much, sir, for joining in.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Mr. John, let's come to the very important agreement between Iran and Oman at this maritime framework that we see, a temporary corridor that has been created. What do you think, what is your take on, first of all, this new establishment and development?
Some details. First and foremost, the United States and almost the entire international community has made very clear that any tolls or fees that look or smell or feel like tolls are completely unacceptable. Unfortunately, it's been the position of the IRGC of the Islamic Republic of Iran that there will be some type of a payment mechanism. If that's the case between Iran and Oman in this agreement, then I don't think it'll have any validity.
Right. Mr. John, do you think that is it some kind of a confidence building measure between the two countries, Iran and Washington, or Iran is looking, or maybe trying to prevent an economic crisis from happening?
I don't think there's any real talk about anything resembling a confidence building measure between Tehran and Washington right now. From all indications, the Trump administration believes that this regime is no longer worth spending any time speaking with. I mean, I think that's the impetus between President Trump giving Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent full reign to, as he put it over the weekend and then in the news conference the other day, to economically asphyxiate the Iranian economy and to bring about regime collapse. So there's really no trusting the Tehran regime from the White House currently. I don't think anything that Tehran under this regime can do to bring about that trust again. I think President Trump feels he was very much betrayed after the 60-day agreement that was struck back several months ago in June that the Iranian regime violated on several occasions. And it's why President Trump, I believe, has now proceeded with this economic strategy on top of maintaining as ironclad a naval blockade on all Iranian maritime imports and exports as possible.
Right.
You have spoken about the economic sanctions and the policies that are there, and it is obviously hurting Tehran also. But could you also tell us what is the end point here? What is the end state here after these sanctions? Do you want a collapse of the regime, or do you think that the administration eventually wants to return to negotiation table so that there can be some kind of resolution in the longer run?
A good question. And I can tell you that here in Washington, D.C., I don't think there's a clear answer. We've heard hyperbolic statements from President Trump and other administration officials since the war began in late February. And then there's been a quick 180-degree turn towards negotiations, towards some measure of diplomacy, certainly on a tactical level, to get the Strait of Hormuz opened again, to get not only crude oil out to markets, but very importantly, LNG, LPGs, fertilizers, petrochemicals that are so essential to so many markets around the world. But the larger goal still remains ensuring that Iran never attains a nuclear weapons capability. And we've lost much of that focus because we've been talking about the Strait of Hormuz for the last 5.5 or 6 months. I don't know to what extent President Trump will hold fast to this. If we look at some media reports here in Washington and from capitals around the world, there's talk of a so-called potential ceasefire, some type of a diplomatic breakthrough. I think right now, given that this maximum sanctions, and there's never quite maximum, there's always room for more sanctions, I believe. But I think that for the time being, I believe the administration will hold fast to this economic sanctions route in addition to the naval blockade. But you never know with President Trump. He's a mercurial president, and he could decide based on information he receives from leaders in the Middle East and in Southwest Asia that it's time for a policy change. But I think right now he'll be holding fast for quite some time.
Mr. John, we know mine clearance has also been discussed and the navigation arrangements have been discussed at length. Does this mean a changed security arrangement in the Strait of Hormuz, or do you think Iran is trying to control or have the navigation under its control itself?
It seems to me that at least from the actions and statements from the IRGC over the last 6 months, and I mean, effectively, they are the government, the supreme leader is either dead or comatose or badly maimed and unable to render any type of leadership or decision in Tehran. So we're dealing really with the IRGC here. It seems they believe that in lieu of the development of the nuclear weapons program that may have been severely curtailed both by the US strikes in June of 2025 and the initial attacks late February and throughout March into early April, that they don't really have the nuclear weapons program currently to use as leverage in diplomacy, but their major leverage is the ability to stop shipping through the Strait of Hormuz and 20% of the world's hydrocarbons, which are so critical to the global economic lifelines around the world. But the question is going to be ultimately, to what extent is there going to be some type of a dissent inside the Iranian government? We already hear from the parliament speaker, from the president of Iran, possibly other leaders that are very much concerned. Certainly the central bank chief has also warned that the Iranian economy really cannot withstand this kind of pain much longer. And the question is, will they prevail, or will the hardliners in the IRGC say 92, 93 million Iranians and their extreme poverty be damned? We're going to continue to demonstrate resistance against the United States and its backers in the Gulf Cooperation Council community.
Right. Mr. John, can this temporary corridor really evolve into some kind of a regional security mechanism? And if that becomes a reality, or that is so, what would be like the traditional role of US in the Gulf from security point of view?
So much of this still remains to be seen based on the actions of the Arab countries, the Sunni Arab neighbors around the Persian Gulf, near the Gulf of Oman, and frankly in the Red Sea. To the extent that we're seeing very credible new infrastructure plans being laid out that provide for pipelines and highways and railways across the United Arab Emirates from its western coast inside the Persian Gulf to its eastern coast near the port of Fujairah and other potential ports in the Gulf of Oman. You'll see a weakening of dependence on the Strait of Hormuz. Certainly, Saudi Arabia already has the East-West pipeline. They're going through the Suez Canal in Egypt to bypass the Houthi attacks from Yemen in the southern mouth of the Red Sea, and the extent to which we'll see additional pipelines being built connecting Kuwait and Iraq, maybe across Syria, through Turkey, to the Mediterranean Sea. But really, I think you're seeing the beginning of the end of the strategic importance of the Strait of Hormuz relative to where it was on February 27th. It'll still be a key waterway, but I don't think you'll be seeing 20% of hydrocarbons moving out of there in the next 2 to 3 years, as long as there is an abnormal terrorist supporting regime in Tehran. If you can have a normal government that actually cares for building up the economy of Iran and of providing for the well-being of 92 to 93 million Iranian citizens, you could have maybe some type of normalcy restored, but not under the current regime.
Right. You have actually spoken about the possible end of Tehran's leverage when it comes to waterways. And I see your point regarding Fujairah. But regarding East-West pipeline, it cannot circumvent, Houthi challenge that is there in that sea. Maybe you can also give us some timeline. How long do you think Iran will be able to exercise this kind of leverage? Secondly, I wanted you to also come back to the sanctions because they are very important. And at this moment, as we see, these are essentially secondary sanctions. So there are countries which are very important to the US as we speak, including China. Do you think that they are going to be impacted also? And does it mean that we are going to end up in a new Cold War where we have formal decoupling because of Iran?
So on the first question, sir, it's very difficult to determine today with any accuracy how long it'll take for this infrastructure to be built out. You're right. Currently, we have the East-West pipeline that is the major connection between Saudi Arabia's Persian Gulf refineries and facilities and the like. The question will also be what additional pipelines will be built, and will they be built underground in order to be able to evade attack by Iran in 6 months, in a year, in 2 years? As long as the physical infrastructure is above ground, it'll be easy for this current regime, if they remain in power, to be able to attack. Keep in mind also that the IRGC has also threatened potentially to take out Saudi Arabia's desalination plants. And you're talking here about the mass death of Saudi citizens by the millions if they're without water for more than several days. So this is the kind of demented policy that we see coming out of Tehran that will be permanently destabilizing throughout the Persian Gulf region as long as they remain in power. But I don't know how long this infrastructure will take to build out. It depends on what kind of investments the governments are willing to take, private companies coming in, and the extent to which they try to produce as many multiple, redundant, overlapping pipelines, railways, and highways as possible. That's going to be really a matter for the governments and the public and the private sector to work out in each individual country and then in mini laterals throughout the Arabian Peninsula. On your second question, sir, again, that remains to be seen. We're looking at three aspects, I would say, of this new Scott Bessent policy of economic asphyxiation. We're looking at questions of speed, scope, and scale. Clearly, we did not have all of the sanctions announced on Monday. What we're hearing is that President Trump, probably Treasury Secretary Bessent, and maybe other leading administration officials are speaking to their counterparts in as many of Iran's leading trading partners as possible. Potentially John Radcliffe, the CIA director, who was in Moscow yesterday, ostensibly to talk about the potential mobilization of about 500,000 new Russian soldiers for a campaign this winter against Ukraine, and also ongoing hybrid attacks against NATO countries over the last several weeks, probably was also speaking to Vladimir Putin or to his people about whether or not Russia would abide by this kind of a sanctions regime against Iran, given that Russia and Iran have such close trading ties and they have the Caspian Sea to be able to evade the US blockade in the Gulf of Oman. So it's going to be very difficult to see how this plays out in terms of scope. 40% of the Iranian economy is in the black market, largely controlled by the IRGC with the help of religious charities, foundations, and don't forget trading networks by land. Iran has 7 land neighbors that go back centuries, way before there were any of the modern borders in the Middle East. And then their scale. To your question, sir, will China be compelled? I don't know if that's going to be a serious issue until Chairman Xi comes from Beijing to Washington in about a month to meet with President Trump. Other leading trading partners such as Pakistan, Turkey, Iraq, the UAE decided already before the sanctions were announced that they were going to be cutting off all financial and trade ties with Iran. But these are very important countries. And so I think the administration is being very careful. As Treasury Secretary Bessent said, he does not intend to blow up the global economy. This will be implemented gradually, slowly, but I believe with significant determination.
Right. Mr. John, we've been talking about the Washington strategic shift from military to, economy now, economic pressure from Iran. But we also know that Iran has been in isolation, and it has been vowing to not bow down even this time. So do you think that Washington's strategy of economic pressure is actually going to bring Iranian side on the negotiating table, or is it going to embolden IRGC hardliners with regards to not making any concession?
That's probably more towards the second option that you're offering, Maheen, but let me also offer a third option. Unfortunately, it's almost always a matter when you have this type of very, very severe sanctions that are being imposed, that it's the everyday citizens, the residents of a country who are undergoing extreme poverty and hyperinflation and extraordinary stress economically, personally, professionally, and the like. And my sense is that you'll also see another effort to try to mobilize armed aspects of the Iranian citizenry, along with possible end of payments to the Artesh, the regular professional military, who will see that a future for Iran under the IRGC is no longer tenable for the Iranian people. And the degree to which you might see an actual civil war break out between the Artesh and the IRGC is also potentially another option that we're looking at.
Right. Mr. John, how much leverage does Iran get now in terms of the navigation or the control of the traffic in the Strait of Hormuz? Because we have been talking about the latest development between Iran and Oman. So how would you look at the Iran's position right now when it comes to negotiating?
Again, I don't know if there's any negotiation to speak of. I mean, Iran and Oman can negotiate, and countries like Pakistan and Qatar and Turkey have been helpful in trying to mediate some type of a resolution here. But again, as I said earlier, I believe right now the Trump administration has nearly zero patience for so-called negotiations with the Iranian regime. They believe that historically the Iranian regime has used negotiations in order to lull either the US or the international community, especially on the nuclear weapons program, which again must remain the ultimate focus of what is happening in the Persian Gulf region. And again, the issue about the Strait of Hormuz is tactical. It needs to be reopened to where it was on February 27th. That's international law and international agreements, which every country around the world right now, except Iran, abides by. So I think that's going to be the critical issue here. And I don't know that Iran has much leverage to use. If we're looking at some of the numbers that are coming out, at least from the Trump administration, on increased amounts of crude oil that are coming out of the Gulf, anywhere from 40 to 60% of where we were on February 27th, which is good news for the global economy because much of the remaining oil that is bottled up is being made up from the US, Argentina, Nigeria, other oil producing countries. But the problem besides energy, we have to emphasize this, is the fact that we have large quantities of petrochemicals, fertilizers that are so essential, especially to poorer countries in South Asia, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America. We're going into the second planting season now in September, and we still have skyrocketing inflation for fertilizer as well as diminished supplies that may lead to food insecurity in many parts of the world. So this is not simply about who controls the Strait of Hormuz and whether oil gets out, but so many other essential components of the global economy all depend on free and open access through Hormuz, and the degree to which Iran is thwarting that will keep it in further and deepening isolation, I believe.
You have spoken about fertilizers, and various analysts say that there are only 2 months when one shouldn't have this kind of blockade. And it is interesting that the war was started during those months. So the question then remains, what about strategy? But apart from that, also, you said something fascinating about the possibility of IRGC fighting it out with Atish or the local army. Do you see any evidence to indicate that? Because on the economic front, I take your point. Iran's currency has almost collapsed. $1 fetches at more than 200,000 real. But apart from that, we haven't seen that kind of discomfort between various forces within Iran so far. Have you seen any evidence of that sort?
We have not seen any open source intelligence on any rumblings along those lines yet. But we also see, as I mentioned before, only half jokingly, that we keep hearing references to maximum sanctions, which the Trump administration had claimed it had imposed on Iran in the first Trump administration. And clearly, there are still so many sanction tools that are available to the administration, and there are even more beyond what Scott Bessent announced the other day. The question is going to be how much pain is the US and our Gulf Arab partners willing to impose on the Iranian people to help encourage them to bring about that kind of a revolt against the IRGC. And again, we're very much reminded of the massacre of anywhere from 20 to 40,000 Iranian citizens in a matter of days back in January for protesting the economic conditions with utter mismanagement of the economy by the IRGC. And at that point, it was still the former supreme leader before he was executed that had imposed on the Iranian people. Keep in mind, this is an extraordinarily wealthy country with some of the largest natural gas and hydrocarbon reserves in the world. And the Iranian people today have a per capita income of about $3,500 US, ranking 140th in the world. The Persian people should be in the top 20. And it's really been the utter mismanagement and the destruction of the economy for the sake of wasting hundreds of billions of dollars in a nuclear weapons program, promoting terrorism throughout the Gulf, in Europe, here in the United States, and proxy organizations that have continued to destabilize countries around the Middle East that make this regime in Iran a singular menace to every country from the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean.
Right. And you're absolutely right regarding the potential of Iranian people. Some of the most beautiful people I've met in my life, but they suffer because of the policies and because of the sanctions. Now, the actual question is how to actually make a policy which hurts the regime, but not the people of Iran. At this moment, it is clear that whatever policy options are there, they are essentially going to hurt the people before they have any impact on the establishment, so to speak, in Tehran. So how do you actually balance between the two options?
I think that's one of the greatest challenges that this administration and our allies in the region face. How do you isolate as much as possible the IRGC and its cronies, right? And the besiege and the police inside of Iran that are acting against the interests of the Iranian people. It's extraordinarily difficult because, as I mentioned earlier, about 40% of the Iranian economy is controlled by the IRGC. And there are these shadow networks. There are terrorist organizations conducting money laundering and drug trafficking in other parts of the world that are funneling cryptocurrency and digital assets to Iran. I think that's one of the reasons why Secretary Bessent mentioned specifically digital assets in his sanctions, the stepped up sanctions the other day. But the question is going to be ultimately, how do you persuade the IRGC? And are there potential divisions within the IRGC? Is there sort of a majority that is probably very ideologically and perhaps theologically committed? And then do you have people who are less ideologically or theologically committed to that apocalyptic vision and are thinking, okay, well, we join the IRGC because it pays well, it offers job security, and I have access to power, but this position is destroying my country. So I think we're looking to see, working with the intelligence community, ideally in Pakistan, in Saudi Arabia, in Gulf countries, and probably Israel for that matter, to see where there are potential wedges and divisions within the IRGC so that in addition to a possible Artesh uprising, maybe later this year or early in 2027, that we can whittle away the solidarity of the IRGC and break it apart from within.
The concern right now is that on one side you have Strait of Hormuz, which is already compromised, but then we see Bab al-Mandab coming under pressure also. The Saudis also put together a coalition. The US is also in the region. Why is it so difficult to contain Houthis in that region so that trade can proceed without any consequence?
I think to a large degree, the US and our Gulf Arab partners in the region underestimated Iran's ability, A, to attack US bases, where 40,000 personnel have been stationed to protect the free and open waterway of the Strait of Hormuz to the benefit of the global economy, obviously to protect our Gulf Arab partners and their facilities and their economies against the Iranian regime, especially since they took power in Tehran in 1979. And also, I think we underestimated their willingness to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, knowing that it would inflict great pain on the Iranian economy as well. So I think there were a number of miscalculations in Washington. Obviously, a war that the president said would last a mere 4 to 6 weeks is now deep into its 6th month. So there are miscalculations here. And I think the wisest thing that we can do here in Washington, along with our partners in Southwest Asia, in the Middle East, is to adapt to a changing military landscape. And as we know from history, no war ever ends the way its planners launched it. Everything is a matter of adaptation to changing circumstances on the ground, at sea, in the air. And that's where we are now. And so I think what you're seeing is not so much kinetic offensive activity by the US against Iran, unless it's going to be retaliation for some type of potential Iranian attack, which we're very carefully monitoring right now between now and the end of October to influence the November congressional elections here in Washington, D.C., and possibly even the Israeli elections in late October. So we're very concerned about some type of an Iranian offensive throughout the Middle East, or maybe just targeting US bases and Israel. But we have to learn from our mistakes. There have been many mistakes that have been made by Washington. We need to learn from them, and we need to have a sharper focus on what the end game is going to be. And that is ensuring again and again and again. And I thank you for your forbearance on this, ensuring that Iran never has a nuclear weapons capability, ever.
Thank you very much, Mr. John Sitilides, geopolitical strategist, a senior fellow CNI, for joining our show, and we hope you join us again soon. We really appreciate your time and your comments.